Hello, thank you for being with us today. I'm Ellie Witter. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement for the Miami University Alumni Association. This year, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the relationship between Miami University and the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. Miami University and the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma first connected in 1972 when Chief Forrest Olds, having heard about a university in Ohio that shared a name of his tribal nation, showed up on campus unexpectedly during a visit to Cincinnati. What came of that surprise encounter is now a 50-year-long partnership between the two Miamis. Today, we are joined by Daryl Baldwin for the first installment of the Myaamia Center webinar series entitled Why Revitalize Myaamia Language and Culture. For many Indigenous communities, language and culture lie at the heart of the group's identities. The preservation of these unique identities requires a great deal of resources and commitment from the community and its leadership. Today's webinar will examine how the Myaamia people have responded to this challenging need and what role the Myaamia Center plays in the larger revitalization for the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. Today, we are joined by Daryl Baldwin, who is a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and serves as the Executive Director of the Myaamia Center at Miami University. Daryl has spent the last 30 years working with his community to build capacity around language and cultural education. I am so pleased to welcome you, Daryl. Thank you for being here. There will be time at the end for questions, so please submit your questions with the link just below the screen. And now I will turn it over to Daryl.
Wamishinewe, Ellie, thank you. And Ayacheki, Tepewe Neolaka Koke, Tepewe Shite Ane Waha Epiane, Nugi Kakikwe, Kinwala Nisi Wayneswiani. I'm really glad to be here, and it's always a nice opportunity to visit with alumni and to share the work that we're doing here on campus, and especially in the context of this incredibly unique relationship between a sovereign Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and a world-class institution like Miami University. So it gives me great pleasure to be here today. And I want to thank the Alumni Association for providing us an opportunity, not only just for myself, but for several of the staff here in the center who are going to be giving a lot more detail about the work that they do. I think I probably will go ahead and start my slides. And let's see, I've not scripted this talk. I kind of, when I put this presentation together, I thought this might be an opportunity for me to kind of reflect on the years of work that we've put into this effort, maybe even draw on some of my experiences. So I kind of wanted it to be a little bit more free-flowing, a little bit more personable for you all, as opposed to a scripted talk. And since so many of the staff are going to be talking about the details of their work in the center, I thought it might be most appropriate for me to maybe give this broader, larger context, kind of the larger context of why this work happens, not only just in the larger context of the tribe today, but also there's a historical context for this work that I think is important to acknowledge. So we'll go ahead and get started. I think I've planned for somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes, depending on how much I want to ad-lib on various aspects of this presentation. So I wanted to start with this particular map. This is a map of North America, as I'm sure you can all see, that's color-coded by language family. So these are the ranges of various indigenous language families across North America prior to European settlement. And what I want you to get from this image is that North America was already colonized. It was colonized by nearly 300 different language speakers who are associated with various language families. And when Europeans came here, this is what they would have bumped into. They would have bumped into many different groups of people, highly diverse. If you take a look on the West Coast, you'll see there's a higher level of diversity, especially as you get into the mountainous regions of the West. There were about 100 different languages spoken in what is today California. Notice the color, it's kind of a beige color. If you hone in on the state of Michigan, that particular color there, and it extends on up into Canada and then includes down Illinois. And actually that color should come over and include parts of Ohio and all of Indiana. That particular color is associated with the Algonquian language family. There's about 25 different languages in that family, and one of those languages is the Myaamia language, which this talk is going to be more relative to today. These languages represent a wide range of unique knowledge systems. Our languages are the most effective and efficient means of communicating our ways of knowing, our value system. Our entire Indigenous knowledge system is expressed through our actions, but also through our languages. And so languages, even though we can talk about different cultures and different languages, the most efficient way to express a culture is through its own language. And that's why language is so critical to cultural preservation. The settling of America during the 17th and 18th century would bring these indigenous knowledge systems and ideologies in direct conflict with European notions of nationhood. So you have two groups coming together, very different ideas around land, around peoplehood, around nation states and ownership, relationship to the landscape, whatever that may be. And so it really just set off really what is a firestorm for many, many years. And the bulk of this talk is really about the outcomes of that we're still, we look back on the settlement of America as happening a long time ago, but what many may not really connect to is the effects of that settlement, for at least for Indigenous people, are still very much felt today. And much of the work of the center is in responding to that. So that's really the larger context that I want to be able to give today. There's several periods in the development of this country that a number of policies emerge from, and these policies are largely reflective of how the governments at the time see, understand Indigenous people, interact with Indigenous people. One of the things we want to establish early on is that tribes never gave up their inherent right to govern themselves. So although America was trying to create itself as a nation, there were already self-governing entities, which today are called Indigenous nations or First Nations people, that were already here. And we preserve that right to govern ourselves through the treaty process. That treaty process was a means by which this growing nation could acquire, gain access to, and in some cases control over the Indigenous populations that were already here. And through the process of the treaties, oftentimes goods were traded for land. Sometimes treaties were the outcome of physical conflicts. There's a lot of different reasons that groups would be forced to come to the treaty table. And I do use the term force a lot. You'll hear that, forced relocation. These treaties were very much forced upon nations. Our ancestors didn't have a lot of negotiating power at this time. And so they, I think, as time would go on, their ability to control the outcomes of some of these policies became less and less, became very difficult. Once you get through the treaty period, and the Miami signed 13 different treaties starting in 1795 up until I think the 1870s might have been the last treaties, you really get into the removal policies. Now, the removal policies I won't have a lot of time to go into, but there was a period of time in the 1830s when most of the eastern half of the United States was well settled and society was beginning to move west. They felt that the tribes were in their way. And there's a lot of reasons why developing states wouldn't want a sovereign entity within its borders. But the goal was to remove these self-governing entities outside of the states and move them west onto lands west of the Mississippi. And that was really the basis for the removal policies. The Miami tribe, like many tribes, were forcibly relocated to reservations in the West. The territory was unorganized at the time. And they were, and at least for our ancestors, they were there until about the 1870s in what is now Kansas. And by the 1870s, they would be moved down to a place called Indian Territory, which was supposed to be a territory set aside for tribes, would later become the state of Oklahoma. And that's how the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma wound up there today, a long ways from its homelands in the lower Great Lakes region. But those removal policies were very common. Most people are familiar with the Cherokee Trail of Tears. What you may not be familiar with is that many tribes have their own Trail of Tears stories. I'll also touch a little bit on the assimilation policies, and this is where the United States began to forcibly integrate tribes into American culture, oftentimes negating their own self-determination rights, their treaty rights. There was a period of time when assimilation was the goal, and we'll talk about the impacts of that. And then we'll kind of flip around and come back to the revitalization policies of what I consider to be really the present. Revitalization is really pretty recent, and the work of the Myaamia Center emerged out of the development of those revitalization policies. So to get us started, I want to just touch on the assimilation policies. The one I'm going to focus on the most is really the boarding schools, because really at the heart of our work here in the Myaamia Center is really education, education of tribal members, supporting the transmission, the revitalization of our language and culture. And so the historical context for that is really emerges out of the assimilation policies of the 1800s, where it was believed that in order to acculturate Native nations, the way you did that was you removed their children from the homes. And in cases where there were siblings, you would separate them, send them to different boarding schools around the country. And through a process of forced acculturation, you essentially removed the language and culture from children. And so the boarding schools had a very devastating effect. If anybody's been following the news, especially up in Canada, that has really come to light in recent times with some of the mass graves from these boarding schools and the children that died during those periods of times. The Dawes Act was very important. That really allotted reservation lands. This was an attempt to break up community. Tribes existed since time immemorial as close-knit, not only close-knit cultural group, but kinship groups, community groups, relying on each other for the well-being of the community as a whole. And one of the ways that they saw to break that up was to break up the reservations and force notions of individualization onto tribal families. And then the Citizenship Act. Again, tribes, Native people were not citizens of the United States until the early 1900s. The Citizenship Act granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. So there was a period of time when our ancestors were not citizens of the United States. Today, we've preserved our citizenship within our tribal nations, and we are citizens of the United States, so many of us consider ourselves to be dual citizens. I want to first make the point that the desire to know, the desire to learn, to be conscious, aware, seeking knowledge, that has always been a valued, inherent aspect of our culture. And we know this from not only the historical records, but in what our elders and what community members have told us about past actions. Myaamia people have they've never been afraid to learn, to engage with people who were different than they were, to learn from them, to share. It was always a process that we valued. However, the boarding schools really began to change the dynamics of that. Remember, the boarding schools were really based on the pretense to, as put in the words of Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, to kill the Indian and to save the man. The idea is really to simply remove all aspects of their cultural identity, to refuse the language to be spoken. They oftentimes used a military format for instruction. This really just had devastating effects on it. Myaamia youth attended boarding schools through this period, not at a very heavy load, but it was enough that the nation, the tribal nation, struggled with what to do with education during this period. On one hand, our tribal leaders wanted Myaamia youth to be educated, to learn the ways of society, but they didn't want them to give up who they were as Myaamia people. And so that created a rift, if you will. The picture up on the left is the Carlisle Indian School. There were Myaamia youth that were there. I can't pull them out of a picture like this, but it gives you a sense of the extent by which children were essentially herded, removed from their homes and put into these institutions. A lot of the outcomes of these institutions aren't immediately relevant. For instance, if a child is removed from their home at a young age and placed in an institution for long periods of time, they lose the ability to observe what it means to be a parent, how to raise children, conflict resolution within the family, and all of the cultural context for these things. So a number of these children grew up and really struggled in how to maintain and build relationships as adults. We didn't fully understand the impacts of that kind of education. We do have some records of Myaamia people like David Jibo, who attended a boarding school, and he came into the school with the ability to speak his Myaamia language. And as he says here, the first whip he received was for talking Indian. That's oftentimes how the older generation refers to their language, as talking Indian. And then, of course, a picture of Haskell where Jesse White, Wapimangwa, again, a young Myaamia man, he's the third one on the left in the back, attended Haskell. Notice the style of dress. The idea was to remove any hint of native clothing and dress them in the period dress. I would also add, and I think it's important to understand that another outcome of these boarding schools was to try to provide a new set of skills for the youth that attended there. And I have over the years met elders who valued their training in the trades or whatever skill they may have attended there. It's just very unfortunate that the second goal of that school was to remove their heritage. The Miami Nation, even after it removed West, continued to struggle with how to deal with the idea of formalized education in the community. There were attempts of the Miami to actually build a school on the reservation in eastern Kansas. I believe that failed. There were times when they sent them to academies like the Choctaw Academy here, but they noticed that when they came back, something wasn't right. So something obviously had happened to them. And so the idea that they couldn't educate their children within their own context, so that the children could go home at night, they could be around family, being reinforced by community. I think our tribal leaders really struggled with that. The outcome was fairly tragic. Too many years of this and generations later, there begins to become a devaluation of our own knowledge system, our own unique human knowledge system. And so Myaamia people, especially older folks, began to develop notions of cultural shame. And that cultural shame would be inadvertently passed down through the generations. I remember back in the 1990s when I first began my work, there was a very elderly man in Indiana who, as a kid, used to visit his grandfather's farm. And his grandfather always spoke to the animals in Myaamia. And when the young boy asked his grandpa to teach him the Myaamia language, I remember him saying that his grandfather replied, "Life will be too hard for you if you learn to speak our language." And so, this is where the disconnect starts to happen. This is where really important aspects of our identity, our language and culture are no longer passed down. So that finds us in the early 1900s. And the 1900s is really where I think the residue of the boarding schools coming to an end, keeping in mind that there were still boarding schools up until the 1970s. And especially up in Canada, I think there might have been some as late as the 1980s. So that's still pretty recent. But the 1900s is really, I think, a period of transition if we want to look at it that way. It was as early as 1934 that the Indian Reorganization Act was passed by Congress. And this was really, I think, a recognition of the failures of previous policies, that the forced assimilation of these tribal nations is not going well and it's having devastating effects. Therefore, Congress finally reached a point where it said, all right, if nations are going to survive and they're going to be here and we have to deal with them, unfortunate perspective that America has to deal with its Indian citizens, the people that were here first, that they need to set themselves up in a governmental structure by which the United States can in fact engage with them. And so one of the things they put forth was to push tribes to develop constitutions. These constitutions would be governing constitutions, and it would set up a legal framework by which the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is who directly deals with tribes today, could engage with tribes as sovereign dependent nations as they're known today. And so the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act was intended to set that up. Of course, Oklahoma had a fair number of tribes. I believe there's 39 tribes in Oklahoma today. They had a separate act in 1936 that did essentially the same thing. However, there was a step backwards, and that's why I have the second bullet there in red. Again, Congress came forward and said, we need to terminate tribes. We need to not deal with tribes anymore. And that's a really unfortunate perspective. It's clearly a step back. It completely abrogates the treaty responsibilities that had been set forth for generations prior. And there were about 100 different tribes that were terminated during this period. Again, it became very clear that this was a huge mistake, and in the Johnson administration, they ended termination. Many of the tribes that were terminated during this period of time have not been able to reestablish their legal status in the United States as federally recognized tribes. So there was a lot of harm caused there. It isn't until you get into the 1970s that there is a recognition that tribes as self-governing entities have a right to determine their own future. And so the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act starts to come into play. And then by the late 70s and more importantly up into the 90s, you get some legislation that's, I think, got a little bit more teeth in it. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act allowed for the freedom of cultural expression, cultural practices, ceremonies. There was a period in time in American history when Native American ceremonies were outlawed. In 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, an important landmark legislation that recognized that as Indigenous people, we have a right in the say of the disposition of our ancestors' human remains. Because prior to this point, Indigenous human remains had been dug up for a long time. They were used as part of scientific study, and we really just didn't have any say in what happened to our grandparents' human remains. They could be dug up at will by any archaeologist who had an interest. There was a cranial study in the early 1900s that attempted to use cranial dimensions to determine intellect, which proven to be a failed research project. So all of that was starting to at least be recognized that these were not appropriate things to do. And then by 1990, the Native American Languages Act. A lot of us think that the 1990s Native Language Act was too little too late, but nonetheless, it was an important recognition that yes, we have an inherent right to our Indigenous languages. Indigenous people don't have other countries to go to where their languages are spoken. Our languages are from here, and if we're going to be able to maintain and preserve them, then this is where they will be spoken and need to be taught. So in 1996, the Myaamia tribe received its very first language grant, which was an outcome of the 1990 Native American language legislation. The Administration for Native Americans was a granting agency of the federal government that administrated funding to tribes to begin to establish language programs. 1996 was not that long ago, but it was the first time that we had, as a tribal community, some funding to really begin to explore what language would look like for us. For our particular tribe, our last speakers passed sometime between, I would say the 50s and 70s. It's hard to know when the last speaker passed. The language was used and declined during that period until there were no longer any speakers. And so much of our work would have to come from the use of archival materials, which I'll come back to. But it was out of the 1996 language grant that we took really what was the next few years to explore what was possible at the community level. Much of the language work that was happening prior to this time was happening on the individual level in family homes and tribal homes. And there was a growing interest among tribal members to want some aspect of their language and culture reestablished. It had been preserved in the homes up until this point, and it was not getting passed on. And so it finally reached a point where the tribe as an entity was going to have to begin to address the perpetuation of Myaamia language and culture. So the founding of the Miami Tribes Cultural Resource Office was in 2000. This was long after the grant had come to an end, and we at least had developed an understanding within the community and among tribal leaders, and began to garner support that this was worthy of development on the tribal level. It was very shortly after that the founding of the Myaamia Center, used to be the Myaamia Project, it became the Myaamia Center in 2013, happened. And so the Myaamia Center and the Cultural Resource Office were intended to work together, kind of as a right and a left hand set of entities. The Cultural Resource Office was responsible for really community programming, handling some of the more sensitive issues like the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation tasks that would be involved there. And the Myaamia Center would be more focused on research and educational development. And so it made sense for the Myaamia Center to be located within an academic setting. It was at that time that we reached out to our friends at Miami University. We had a relationship dating back to the 1970s, and we asked them if they'd be willing to explore the possibilities. And so in 2001, I came to Miami University as the founding director, and I had a 3-year contract. I mean, basically, we were just going to explore to see if there was anything really possible here. So then over the next several years, the Myaamia Center just had its 20th birthday. I would say, that may back up a little bit. I would say that for a good 15 years, we were pretty much under the radar. We were focusing on building infrastructure and capacity, responding directly to tribal needs, and trying to get our bearings around what was possible. And keep in mind, this is very unique. There were no models in the United States that we could look at as a model for what to do with the center. So we were literally building from scratch, and we were trying to find our way in this. Over time, we would develop a very interdisciplinary structure. It became clear that educational development for the tribe was going to require a lot of resources, a lot of skill sets. We would be tapping into a lot of disciplinary units here on campus in order to build this. And so this is the structure that has emerged, at least into the present. I won't be able to go into a lot of these, but these are the units within the center that support what is today the development of the Miami Tribe's educational infrastructure around language and cultural transmission. I would say that we focus on 4 distinct developmental areas. There is education, that's really both formalized and informal, preservation, building capacity, which really involves the training and development, planning activities, and then community engagement. There has to be physical engagement on the community level to reinforce the things that are being revitalized. And so these four components really come together in a very strong way, both for the Myaamia Center and for the Cultural Resource Office. And we work together to grow these four areas. So to that end, let's touch on some of these. Preservation comes in a couple of different forms. One, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that for the vast majority of our human existence, oral transmission of knowledge has been the primary means by which information, history, knowledge, culture gets passed on from generation to generation. There is a skill set involved in that. There is a requirement for interaction that's involved in that. And so in order for us to maintain that, we want to make sure that there's some aspect of oral transmission. It might be something as simple as our winter storytelling cycle, or it could be one-on-one mentorship or interaction. Preservation also comes in the form of archival materials. At the time that we really began this work, we did not know the extent of our linguistic archival resources. It was the work of Dr. David Costa, who now heads up our language research office and will be one of the presenters here at the end of the year. It was through his work that he not only established a basic grammar and sound system for the language, but he also uncovered what would become approximately 270 years of documentation on what is now known as the Myaamia language, or Myaamiata Wangi, as we say in our language. And so David's contribution to this particular archival resource has been incredible. I think many of you can look at this particular example of a page out of, I think this is Jacob Dunn's language materials from the early 1902. And, you know, other than the Myaamia, I think you can probably catch up some of the English. But keep in mind that some of our materials are pretty messy. So this is from the Jesuit era. This is a document that comes out of the early 1700s, maybe late 1600s. These materials emerged really at a period of contact when Jesuit missionaries were living within these villages. They were attempting to translate the Bible and other religious texts into the native language, but they were also observing daily activities. And so these are very rich materials for us, although we do have to be careful in how we use them. These materials are scattered all over the country and up into Canada. Probably our most recent one was found in an archive in Montreal, Canada, and was from the 18th century, I believe. So archival development and the maintenance and management of these archives as a resource for content and information has become pretty vitally important to our work. And so you can see that we have an ever-growing, I guess, hierarchy of archives that need to be maintained and managed. Some of these are just, you know, they can be specialized language materials, even photographic archives. I mean, we have a photographic archival database of about 80,000 right now, both in terms of historical and contemporary photos, just being able to manage the work that we're doing and the archival materials, the older materials in and of itself. The Myaamia tribe does have a Myaamia Heritage Museum and Archive located in Oklahoma. We do have a Myaamia collection here at King Library in special collections that is open to the public. So again, we try between the tribe and the university to maintain what is really a growing archival resource. Capacity building, in my mind, in the context of our work, is really about the development of skills, of knowledge, so that we can carry out the kinds of revitalization activities that are of interest to the community. And so taking something as simple as revitalizing our traditional lacrosse, our form of the traditional lacrosse game, has taken many years, as you can see, from 1998 till 2019. We're still evolving that. Lacrosse is now recognized international sport. What many might not realize is that lacrosse is a North American indigenous game in its origins. And so many tribes have their own form, they have their own set of game rules, they have their own stick styles, their ball styles. There can be a lot of difference from tribe to tribe, but many tribes, especially in the Great Lakes area, have a form of lacrosse that they play. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois Nation, they are often viewed as, in my mind, kind of being the masters of traditional lacrosse. And so, we recognize that they have continued this sport unbroken and entered into the professional realm as a tribal nation. So it's very impressive to see what they've been able to preserve. But for us, we've had to relearn a lot of these, the stick making, the community context for our games, and then also cultural context when we play lacrosse with other tribal nations whose game rules may be different, or there may be gifting involved, or there may be speeches or presentation at the onset of the game by community cultural leaders or elders. Those are all things that we're interested in preserving and carrying forward in the context of our games. So capacity building is about redeveloping those skill sets and that knowledge. Capacity building is also learning how to do research, getting into the archives, the interpretation of cultural materials, the interpretation and use of language materials. The Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives has a fair amount of materials on the Myaamia. And so we've been very fortunate to have both staff members and some of our tribe students visit these locations and be able to see what is really cultural objects that belong to their ancestors, and in some cases, even grandparents that are known to them. So it's usually a very powerful thing to connect younger people with these heritage objects. Capacity building also involves technology. Technology in and of itself is not going to preserve or promote language and culture, but if we're strategic about its use, then technology can be very helpful to us. We do find that in many cases, we have to build our own websites. We have to develop our own technologies, create our own tools of the trade, if you will, because they're simply not available off the shelf. Capacity building also emerges in our educational field. Excuse me. When we attempt to teach traditional concepts, take for instance a lunar calendar system. Our lunar calendar system is a true lunar system of timekeeping. It has ecological ties to it. There's a lot of cultural information, a lot of language associated with it. And so when we go to teach these things in the community, we have to develop the tools by which we're going to teach. Again, there's no place to go to get training in teaching Myaamia culture and language. And so we have to create those tools and those methodologies. And so there's a lot of material creation as part of our capacity building efforts. We have a growing base of educational programs. I would say one of the things we don't have at this time, and there aren't plans, is we don't have a bricks and mortar education. In other words, we don't have a schoolhouse. The Myaamia population largely lives in diaspora. We are able to come together for events, and there's lots of learning opportunities there. We do have a growing base of youth programming during the summer. We're doing a lot more outreach. We're also really trying to tap into the different age groups. Again, curriculum and programming has to be designed and targeted for specific ages. So we're slowly building what is really a wide profile of educational learning opportunities for tribal members at different age. We're trying to close the gap between cradle to grave, allowing any tribal member of any age, of any generation, of a variety of interests to be able to engage with the work of the center and the Cultural Resource Office. We also have a growing body of tribal students, which you'll learn more about in a following presentation. We currently have 39 tribe students on campus. When I came here in 2001, I was trying to remember, there were somewhere between maybe 4 and 6 tribal members here in 2001. So our base has grown significantly, and that growth has largely been because of the growth of language and cultural revitalization. So our young people are excited to be involved. They are embracing their heritage and wanting to learn more about who they are as Myaamia youth. And so we provide that opportunity here at Miami University. Miami tribe students come in under the Myaamia Heritage Program. As part of the program, they're required to take a series of 1-credit courses designed specifically around a variety of themes and topics like tribal sovereignty, language and culture, history, ecological perspectives. And they take these courses and engage with the center throughout their time here at Miami University. What we've come to value about this particular aspect is this is an opportunity for a young person to come to a university to pursue whatever degree program they're interested in, while at the same time having their cultural heritage reinforced. And there's something very powerful in that. If a young person can step into a learning environment where their language and culture is valued, we now know that they perform better academically. So again, when we think of answering the question, why do this? It's really to help reinforce and support our youth. We can't forget about the powerful learning environment of the home. We work very diligently to provide materials to parents, young parents, families who are interested in incorporating and bringing more Myaamia language and culture into the home environment. When a child is born into a household where there is Myaamia language and cultural present, then it just simply becomes part of life. It's not an extracurricular activity they have to engage in. This was the area of much of my earlier work. My wife, Karen, and I, and she did most of the work, provided a home environment for our youth that was rooted in Myaamia language and culture, and we homeschooled for 18 years. We learned what was possible from that effort, and that became a very important personal driver for me in developing programs for families, Myaamia families across country. And again, I've already recognized that this is a community that lives in diaspora, being able to do outreach workshops, having staff that are willing to go to places, to be with Myaamia families or small communities that may be around the country, however they got there, and to be able to provide opportunities for learning and sharing. I can't underestimate the importance of coming together physically, and of course that takes on a new meaning in the era of COVID. We just completed our first midwinter stomp dance for the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma just a couple of weeks ago in Oklahoma. It was the first time we've come together in a couple of years. This is really important. We need to physically be together as a people. And so the Miami Tribe and the Cultural Resource Office work very hard at creating lots of opportunities throughout the year around different events, different seasonal activities for tribal members to come together. And we try to do the same here in Oxford as well, bringing youth, bringing families, bringing adults together so that they can engage with each other around what they're learning. This might include storytelling. We hold storytelling in a variety of events. These are pictures from actually just a week ago where we did our annual midwinter storytelling activities. And I don't want to underestimate the importance of learning from what we're doing. And this is where our assessment and evaluation work comes in. It's important for us as we observe the changes and the impact that this work has on the Miami Tribe community to be able to understand what are the forces at work here. For instance, we know that over time, because of language and cultural development, the community has become more engaged with each other. There's more activities in the community. We know that when we incorporated the Myaamia Heritage classes here on campus, our graduation rates pre-2005 were about 40%. Today, we have a 90% graduation rate among our tribe students. We know that the activities of the center and the language and cultural education is contributing to that higher graduation rate. So all of these things, even though we can observe that they're having positive impact on the well-being of the community, our assessment work gives us more specific details into what's actually happening there. And this gets towards the end of my presentation, and I'm kind of circling back to that very first slide that I showed of North America and the approximate 300 languages that were spoken here. The Myaamia tribe isn't the only tribe figuring out what our future is going to look like, engaging with our communities, engaging with our language and our culture. And it's through the National Breath of Life program, which is the national program of the Myaamia Center, that we're able to connect with other tribal communities who are also engaged in archive-based work for language revitalization. We're largely funded through grants for this program, and over the years, we've engaged with 137 different Native American communities. We're actually just getting ready to launch a brand new apprenticeship program that is grant funded through National Breath of Life. We'll be hiring for 24 months 10 different archivists from 10 different communities to help build their community-directed language archive. So we're really excited for some of the developments that are happening in National Breath of Life. So we often get the question, you know, boy, how do I get involved? How do I learn more about this? And how can I support this work? And there's really a couple of ways. One is, you know, we just encourage people to learn. There's a lot of resources online we can point you to. You know, if you're here on campus, don't ever hesitate to reach out to the Myaamia Center. We're certainly engaged in more outreach activities. We're trying to get more content into the curriculum on campus. And then for those of you that are able and want to support in other ways, there is the Myaamia Center Endowment, there is student support programs, and then there's also our National Breath of Life program. And as I said, there's materials online. We do have our biennial conference is coming up April 9th, which will be here on campus. If you can connect to some of our social media or certainly reach out to any of us here, we're more than happy. We do have a brand new newsletter and we encourage you to sign up. And I think some of those links are going to be made available for you on this talk. I guess in closing, I would just say that I come back to the notion that this relationship is very unique. The Myaamia Nation is very honored and very grateful to have the partnership they have with Miami University. Nepondingi is the term that we use to represent this relationship. That means learning from each other. And I do think that we really do mutually learn from each other and help each other. And we're very appreciative of that. So I think I'll end there and turn it back over to Ellie.
Great, thank you. And we do have a few questions that have come in. One was, how many tribal citizens are there currently? And of those, how many would you consider speakers?
Yeah, so the first part of that question is pretty easy because tribes are self-governing entities. We do have citizenship roles. I don't know the exact number, but it's just over 6,000 tribal citizens. There are many more than that actually have heritage, do have ancestors who are Myaamia. They may or may not actually be enrolled in the tribe, but the tribe currently has just over 6,000 tribal citizens. The second part of that question is a little bit trickier, partly because so much of our material goes out and is being utilized by self-directed learners. We don't always know who those self-directed learners are. We get about 50 youth a summer in our programs, summer programs. We've got tribal students here on campus who are learning and using the Myaamia language. They are not, they do not have high proficiency in the language, but they are learning and using the language. And there could easily be a couple hundred families within the tribal nation who have incorporated some aspect of the language and culture in their home. So it is a growing base, and as our resources grow, that will continue to grow, and hopefully over time, proficiency will grow as well. But it would be pretty hard to put a number on the language speakers.
Great. Another question was, does Miami University offer any classes or programs for learning the Myaamia language? And I'm assuming this is more for a general population, not necessarily the Myaamia Heritage Program.
Right. No, that's a really excellent question. And it's something that we've recognized, especially more recently, that although our initial goal is to respond to the needs of the tribal community, we are in a context of sharing, and the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma is very committed to sharing on campus. We do have an IDS 259 course, which are topics on the Miami Tribe that is open to any student. That is taught by Dr. Cameron Shriver, if anybody wants to look for that. We do a lot of class visits, but more recently we're looking at how we can integrate more content into already existing curriculum across campus. So I would say in the next couple of years, some new opportunities for learning should be emerging. So keep an eye out for those.
Great. Do other tribes have similar relationships with universities, or like the model of the Myaamia Center to the university, is that widely spread across the country or not?
So Miami University does not have a Native Studies program. What Miami University has is a unique relationship with a particular tribe who is indigenous to this region, who has created a center to respond directly to the tribe's needs. That model, I am not aware of anywhere else. I cannot name another institution that has that model. A number of universities do have Native Studies program, but that's not what this is. So to answer your question, I don't know. And I've traveled pretty significantly, and I visited a lot of universities, and I've not seen it yet.
Great. Trying to go through all these questions. Could you recommend any literature on tribal or indigenous history and culture?
Well, I would start. We have a community blog that we put out online, which has lots of different contributors to it, mostly tribal contributors. Covers a number of topics. I think that's really a good read. It's very in the present. It reflects the work that's going on here. It covers a number of topics from revitalization to, we just went through a whole series of blogs on the Miami tribe's removal. I just saw a blog recently about our trip to Oklahoma and midwinter storytelling. So I think that that's a very rich current resource. In terms of historical publications, I'll leave that to our historians to maybe comment on. I don't know that I can name titles off the top of my head.
Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between language and cultural heritage? Has there been examples of how the language revitalization has led to historical discovery?
Right. So I think I mentioned earlier on that we uncovered a manuscript in the Jesuit archives up in Montreal, Canada. This probably would have been around 2015, maybe. And that was a discovery, was one we didn't know was there. The way that it happened was one of our collaborators, one of our researchers, happened to be in that archive doing place names research. And the archivist came out and said, well, we have this old manuscript. It just says Algonquin language on the front, but we don't know which Algonquin language it is. Would you be willing to take a look at it? It's been probably sitting there in the archives for nearly 200 years. And so upon closer examination, we realized that it was the Myaamia, or what's termed today in linguistics, Miami, Illinois language. And so that was a discovery. I would say that the revitalization of language and culture reconnects learners with their indigenous knowledge system. And I think that that's really important. I think there's a lot of discoveries that happen, and I've seen happen in that context. When youth engage with their culture, when they learn about Myaamia ecology, when they make those connections between the calendar, a winter story, an ecological event, then they start to begin to form what is really the basis for a Myaamia perspective. And then language just reinforces that. So although that's hard to articulate in a environment like this, it's a very powerful thing to observe when learners start to connect those pieces.
Absolutely. Another question that came in is, are there other tribal languages similar to Myaamia that fill in the gaps to help understand grammar or syntax? You kind of were speaking about Algonquin nations. Would that be similar?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. Yes, there are closely related languages that have a very similar sound, similar grammatical structure. So the Sauk, Kickapoo, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Shawnee has some similarities. Those languages are all very clearly related to each other and do share not only some grammatical features, but in some cases, some vocabulary. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think we are getting very close on our time. So thank you so much, Daryl, for being with us. I do want to let everyone know that this Myaamia Center webinar series is going to be a 6-part series throughout all of 2022. The next webinar will be on Wednesday, April 13th at noon, and it will be a session on the history of the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma, and will be presented by George Ironstrack, the Assistant Director for the Myaamia Center at Miami University. Also, the information that you had shared in one of your last couple of slides, all of those links will be on the event page for this webinar. So you can certainly reference all of those, and also a recording of this presentation will be available on that event page. So thank you again so much for being with us, Daryl. Is there any parting words?
I'll just say Nepakalo. Nepakalo is a common departing term. It means be conscious, be aware. It's related to our term for learning. So Nepakalo, be well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyway.